Okay. Well, welcome to the program, Manuscript Writing. This is the first part of GSA's Manuscript Writing and Reviewing Skills program, which is developed by a GSA work group of volunteer members from around the world. We have a few housekeeping items to go through, but please, first introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's there. And we'll also use the chat box at the end of the presentation. So please comment or ask questions during the last part of the program, the Ask the Editors segment. Our program is being recorded today and will be archived on the GSA website. And so we'll ask you to keep your video off and audio on mute until it's time for the Ask the Editor segment following our presentations. So without further delay, I'll hand the microphone to Suzanne Meeks, editor of The Gerontologist and chair of this program's work group. Suzanne?
Thank you, Judy. I'm so happy to be here and talking about one of my favorite topics, which is writing and another, editing. So I'm going to jump right in. We have lots of material that's crammed into a relatively short period of time, so we're going to kind of fly through it. Before I start, though, I just want to say originally this presentation was meant to be three people. Dr. Teresa Abba, who's from the California State University, was supposed to do the middle part of this presentation, and she unfortunately had a family tragedy. So sending caring thoughts to Teresa as Jim and I try to manage her slides in the middle. But we thank her so much for her contributions to this work group. So to start, most manuscripts are made up of a foundation or built on a foundation of these three basic building blocks. And you'll have these sort of, if you can think of yourself, think of these as figurative building blocks, you'll have them in front of you or you'll have them with you when you start writing. How you build these things together will vary according to what kind of manuscript it is, who you are, but it's helpful to think about building in the context of these pieces. I temporarily lost my mouse here. Okay, there we go. No, really, I did. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, there's not just one approved method to follow in writing. Some people prefer organizing all their thoughts in an outline. Others never do outlines, but write bits and pieces of paper and then later piece them all together into a coherent argument. Many writers will only come to figure out what their main point is after they've started writing the paper. A lot of others are going to have to develop their main points and their theses beforehand because they're writing it into a proposal, which is usually the way my writing has gone. But then we're talking also about writing proposals where you are starting with kind of from scratch. So not everyone starts with a great idea already organized into a nice logical flow before they start writing. And what I've depicted here is various ways that you can approach writing, sometimes completely circular, sometimes linear, sometimes stair-step, just depends on who you are and what your writing process is. So it's a good idea to kind of know that, but also know that there's no one right way. The imposter syndrome, which most of us experience at one point or another in our careers, is this sense that your ideas aren't worth writing down or that everyone already knows what you're thinking and that you really don't deserve to be putting your ideas out there. So again, most of us or many of us have felt this way at one time or another. And so I want you to know it's not unusual to feel that way, but I also want you to talk yourself out of it in some way. Maybe you can't do that by yourself. Maybe you need to use your writing network, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple of slides, to push you forward. But you do have to tell yourself, you have been tried and found meritorious. That is, if you're in graduate school, you got into graduate school. If you're not in graduate school, you got out of graduate school. So people have already decided that you're meritorious and you deserve to write your ideas down and people should be reading them. So don't worry about your first draft being perfect or even anywhere near perfect. So the role of editing, that comes later. Perfecting is something you do later. First, you get stuff down on paper. So start somewhere, start anywhere, but start writing. That's my first tip. Where you begin could be the beginning. That's a logical place to start. But sometimes the beginning is really hard to write. And if there's some easier part to write, then write that first. So some of us have written a grant proposal already. So we have bits and pieces of our introduction already written, and we have bits and pieces of our methods section already written. So start there. Start with the easy stuff. Like your methods section, you already know what you did. So start with that and then go backwards. There are many different ways to start a paper, and the important thing is just to get going. One thing to think about, of course, is who's going to be reading it. What journal are you aiming for example, if you're writing a journal article? Who is the panel if you're writing a grant review, or a grant proposal? Write to your audience. You want to tailor your paper to whoever is going to be reading it, and that's really important. So this is the part where I said I would come back to this idea of a writing support network. Writing can be a really lonely business. You use a social network in other ways. You probably don't do the research that you're doing all by yourself. You probably have some group of people that you're working with in your research process. But when you sit down to write, they might not all be there. You'd be very lucky if you've got a collaborator where you can sit down side by side and write. I've done that a few times in my career. It's a huge luxury. But most of the time, we're writing by ourselves. But we don't have to do it in isolation. You want to build a network of people who will put eyes on your work. If that's peers or colleagues or collaborators or mentors or whoever they are, somebody else needs to read your work besides you. And that's just critically important. If you don't feel like you have that network, then it's time to start building it. And I've provided here some resources that already exist to help you build that network. But remember that everyone struggles, and because of that, most people are willing to give you time. So ask for feedback, ask for help. That's just really critically important. This is just my writing process put onto a slide, just trying to give you an idea of how I work through the problem of creating a manuscript or creating a grant proposal. This works for me, but you have to do it your own way. I wanted you to see that my writing process is quite circular, especially when I'm writing in a new area for me. I always want to have a time when I'm reading without trying to synthesize. So that's that part over on the left where I'm reading and taking notes, but I'm really not trying to pull it together. After I've taken my notes, and I use literal note cards, then I organize the cards after I feel like I've reasonably saturated my exposure to the existing research. Once I organize the note cards, then I kind of have an outline, and then whatever I'm writing is going to start to write itself. But even as it writes itself, you can see that there's some circularity when I'm getting to the part of writing a manuscript, because, you know, I'll write the introduction, I'll write my hypotheses, or maybe I'll write the hypotheses first and go back and make sure the introduction flows into them. But then as I write my results and discussion, I might go back to my methods. I might even, as I'm writing my results, be doing more analyses to kind of clarify things. So there's this circularity where you're going back and forth among the different parts of your manuscript, trying to make sure that they're all logically connected. So that's just a little bit about process. Now I'm going to turn to talking about just some tips for editing your work, starting with what's in your sentences. So this material I've gotten mostly from other sources, people who have written about writing. And I think it's good for you to read widely about writing. And we've offered some resources at the end of this slide deck. There are some references that we think have been great, but find your own also. A lot of what I'm going to say here comes from a book called Do I Make Myself Clear by Sir Harold Evans, because I thought it was funny and also very clear and really, really helpful, and it really changed my writing. in a major way, really, in the last few years. But it might not be inspirational to somebody else. You have to find your own voice, and therefore you need to find a writing resource who can speak to how you convey your own voice. But good writing doesn't just show up at the beginning of your manuscript. You're going to have to go back and evaluate your own writing critically. One of the things that you can do is to try to get as much of your work as possible from the active voice to, from the passive voice to the active voice. So here's just a simple example of why you might want to think about this. So this blue sentence here is written in the passive voice, and it doesn't tell us who's seeing the actors this way, who's making the claim, or why. So you can rewrite it to just put the author up front. So make sure that the author who's making the claim is recognized. So so-and-so has argued, blah, blah, blah. Another way to go is to put more information with the claim. So something like, despite their many obvious flaws, Hollywood films and actors who appear in them cast a very long shadow on society. So there you're making an argument that's much clearer because it's kind of got data in it. Okay, or something like that. Another example here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these examples, but you'll have copies of the slides and you can go back over them later. Here, I've taken a very typical statement from a review article that's all written in the passive voice and converted it to the active voice. And you'll see that it's both clearer and shorter in the active voice. So we tend to write in the passive voice in our method sections. Somebody somewhere along the line taught us that. And I'm trying to unteach you that and try to put things in the active voice as much as possible. Very helpful to a reviewer or an editor, for example. Good writing should be effective and efficient. And one of the things that we do as academics is we clutter our writing with unnecessary words. And that's one of the things that I like about the book by Sir Harold Evans, because he gives lots of examples of words that really don't add to your writing. They just diminish the clarity and they make it ponderous to read. And that is not something you want. You don't want your reviewers, for example, when you submitted an article to a journal, to feel like they're slogging through your work. They should be going through your work joyfully. They should enjoy your writing. And that can be done by avoiding some of these more ponderous academic conventions that we have. And we all use them. I use them. I promise you, you use them. And as you edit your work, you can learn to look for them and remove them. So here are some more examples of unnecessary words that we see a lot in journal articles. And it's just because they're conventions that we learn that could be turned around to be simpler, more direct, less passive. And so I encourage you to try to find these things in your own work and see if you can't rephrase some things to be clearer. So throughout this presentation, we have some practice it slides that have actual exercises that you can do to try to rewrite or edit some work that we've chosen for you. We won't have time for you to do it during this presentation, but I encourage you to use the worksheets that are provided with the slides to go back and try it at another time. But I am going to fly through some of these just to tell you sort of what my thinking was in providing these examples. So the next slide shows two pieces of text, came from submissions to the gerontologist. These are submissions by perfectly competent scholars who got their work accepted. So these are from published works. So it's not to diminish the quality of the writing. This is not bad writing. I'm only saying writing can be better. It can always be better. So this first one, in the green here, have fixed it. I've only gotten rid of 4 words there, but again, if you're clearer and simpler, that word limit is going to trouble you less. You'll note that I have changed it from the passive to the active voice. I have diminished the phrase regarding experiences of communication and turned it into about communicating, which says the same thing with only 2 words. And I've gotten rid of the double use of regarding. And in this one again, here I've reduced it from 73 words to 56 words. I think it's clearer. Again, my way is one way. It's not the only way. There are many different ways to say things, and you have to find your own voice and your own way of saying things. So I don't want to impose my solutions, which is why I really encourage you to practice these things and see if you can't find ways that are true to your voice and also make things clearer and simpler. As I've said already, the first draft is not perfect, so make time for editing. And by editing, I don't mean proofreading. Yes, you do need to proofread your work, but that is not enough. So you're editing, by editing, I mean be ruthless with your writing. Take time to read through the paper, to look at each individual sentence and the wording of each individual sentence, and then to paragraphs, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and then to the whole document. So with regard to paragraphs, each paragraph needs to work for you. It needs to do a job. And so you need to look at each paragraph and see that it is accomplishing that. It's making a point. And that point is important for the flow of the overall manuscript. And it has a coherent structure where there's a beginning and an end. And you know why it's there. If you don't know why that paragraph is there, get rid of it or find its purpose and edit it. Then you want to take time to read through the whole thing. I mean, I am a compulsive editor. Maybe I edit too much, but I edit my emails 3 times before I send them. And I don't think there's anything that I've ever written that couldn't be improved. And improved again and improved again. So I just think it's really important to take time, which means that you just can't do things at the last minute, I'm sorry to say, because the last minute writing is not going to be your best writing. So after you've edited your paragraphs, you need to look at the flow of all of them and be prepared to move things around. I mean, use your writing network to help you figure out what needs to move, and don't get too attached to your work. Again, be a little bit ruthless with your own work. So in the next slide, you're going to see some paragraphs that were part, again, of a accepted manuscript. Again, this is not bad scholarship by any stretch of the imagination, but these 3 paragraphs did not do their work for this author. They sort of meander, and they don't clearly take the reader from here to there. And I know this is a lot of text for you to look at now, so hopefully you'll have a chance to go back and look at them again and look at what I've done with them. So again, it's trying to figure out what's the purpose of all of this. And in this case, this was early on in the manuscript. The point was to take the reader from what the problem is to what the author was going to do. And that's kind of what I've done here, where I've condensed it into 1 paragraph where it starts with the problem and it ends with the objective of the paper. And there's kind of a clear flow from one to another. But again, there probably are 10, 15, 100 ways to do this, not just my way. I'm only offering one example. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about the various parts of a typical empirical manuscript. Obviously, not all manuscripts have all of these parts. All of them do have an abstract, though, so I'll start there. Here, your abstract is your advertisement for your paper. And so all the guidance on clear and concise language is especially important in your abstract because it's the first thing that everyone's going to read. And it might be the only thing that someone's going to read if it's terrible. So you want to really make it work for you. It needs to really tell the reader what you did and why it's important, and how you did what you did and what conclusions you came to. And if you've got a theoretical framework or model, it needs to be threaded through your abstract, same way as it needs to be threaded for your manuscript. So make your abstract pack power. so that it grabs the attention of the reader and makes them want to read on. So for my practice here, I've offered one of my own structured abstracts from maybe a decade or so ago, maybe longer than that, which doesn't pack the power it should, doesn't really communicate why it was important to do this study or really what we found that was important. So I've also rewritten this. So this is how I would edit this one today. And the main thing is that I've tried to simplify some of it so that I can put more words into what the problem was that I was trying to address with this study and what the take-home message was. So I think a lot of times our abstracts are afterthoughts. We think about them, we write them at the end after we've written everything else usually. And it's like, oh God, right, I have to write this 250-word abstract before I can submit this thing. So, so just throw it up there. And I really would urge you to spend some time with your abstract and make it really work for you. Your introduction is where you convince your reader that your work was an important and meaningful thing to do. And believe me, as an editor, you cannot do that by just telling the reader that your work is important and meaningful, because I'm not going to buy it unless you give me a convincing argument based on theory and or empirical work. So it's not really all of those, oh, it's very important or it's critical to blah, blah, blah. All of those, you could probably just get rid of them and instead show how things are very important or very critical. Because again, just because you say it's so is not going to convince me. Also, you don't want to summarize information that the likely reader already knows. For example, when writing for GSA journal, you don't need to start with platitudes about the aging of the population, the prevalence of dementia, or the stressfulness of caregiving, for just to name a few examples, because your audience knows those things already. So you need to get down to your specific problem and leave the broad background out, because the GSA audience knows that already. Now you might write for another audience that doesn't know that stuff, and then yes, you need to put it in. So again, you need to know your audience. You want to place the problem in the context of the work that's already been done to illustrate how your work moves the field forward. And it's really important to also place it in the context of your own work, especially work that's been done on the same sample. Your literature review will include the most recent contemporary research relevant to your topic, combined where appropriate with classic or theoretical or groundbreaking research. And you'll have to balance the need to give a thorough sense of the scholarly context of your work with not overwhelming your reader with too comprehensive a review where they lose the proverbial forest, or that is your point, in the trees. So this probably means, at least it always does for me, that you're going to write a longer draft of your introduction and then you're going to cut it. And that's what editing is for. So that's what I do. I just write it, it's like I spill it all on the paper, then I go back and cut out stuff I don't need. Finally, and now we're talking about slides that Dr. Abba has developed, and I'm doing my best to translate what was in her mind when she developed these slides. Again, I just want to appreciate her work with this work group. The easiest part, I think, of an empirical paper is writing the methods section, because you know what you did. So I can skim through this pretty quickly. It's still completely essential to do it well. The next two slides present suggestions for quantitative and qualitative methods sections, respectively. The most common mistakes that I see in methods sections are not including enough detail about who is in the sample, especially ethnicity or other identity characteristics, and how those were measured. So how did you get that information from your participants? How and why the data were collected in general. There's often insufficient detail on psychometrics of study instruments. It's also really important to include an analysis section for both quantitative and qualitative studies, although of course they're going to be different. And for quantitative studies, don't forget to cite your specific software packages. And I've got a link here to the Equator guidelines. If you're not familiar with these, you can click on this link, or just put Equator Network in Google and it'll come up. And that's a whole collection of reporting guidelines for what needs to go in your method section and in your results section for various kinds of designs. Qualitative studies that we review at the gerontologist often lack detail, almost always lack enough detail in methodology, including who did what. And again, using active voice is really important here. How the authors ensured rigor, how they determined sample saturation, what specific types of qualitative design and analysis they used. And this latter part is really important. Sometimes it seems like, and I hope this isn't true, but it does seem like it sometimes, that the authors analyzed the data first and then they went back and tried to find out what kind of analysis that actually was by going back to the qualitative research literature to match it. And this tends to not be all that convincing. So I'm hoping that people are designing their studies ahead of time, and then they really need to tell us what they did and what strategies they were using, what kind of design they were using. All right, that ends my section of this presentation. I'm going to turn the slides over. I'm going to unshare my slides and turn over the microphone, as it were, to Jim Dowd, who's Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Georgia. Jim, you are on. And Jim, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I coming through?
I can hear you. You need to put
okay, you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. You need to put your slides in presenter mode.
Yeah, sure. Okie doke. Let us see here. Just bear with me for a minute here. Screen sharing. All right. Okay, can everyone see the slides that are up now?
We can see them. They're just not in presenter mode, but maybe you can just go ahead if, oh, there we go. Now you're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So some of these slides, just to pick up from where Suzanne left off, I want to say a few more words about the reporting qualitative research and some of the difficulties that qualitative research and the reporting of the data sometimes entails. And so there's two kinds of qualitative work that I'd like to talk about. And the first is the qualitative work that involves interview data. Now, if you just have a few interviews, it becomes relatively simple to describe them and to report the data. But it's when you have a lot of interviews that the issue of how to summarize the data and report them in a fair way, that is, not to cherry pick from the interviews that support whatever concept you want to describe, but to try to summarize the data accurately. So even with interview data, just like with a quantitative paper, you can provide tables that summarize a particular issue with a simple numerical count of how many people in your interview sample said this as opposed to that. But I think more typically is when we have direct quotations from the research. And sometimes, and I think this is true with graduate students who are doing for their dissertation, maybe did a lot of interviews, the initial draft of a dissertation, the analysis section, might include nothing or almost nothing but direct quotes. And so the issue is how to select a particular quote that fairly summarizes the central tendency within your sample, or maybe to select a quote that is unusual or disconfirms what you're trying to do. But I think the point here is to keep the quotations relatively short so that the reader doesn't have to read an entire page of quotation, and don't overuse the quotes, because it's your analysis of those quotes that people will want to read as opposed to the quotes themselves. So yeah, try to keep them short. Another type of qualitative work is field research or ethnographic research. And here the reporting of the data is difficult. And the reason it is difficult because the researcher, him or herself, was involved with the subjects. And so it's not only a matter of describing the interviews, but the researcher will describe the observations of the actual field setting or particular situations within that setting, as well as describing particular subjects. The interviews that are typically conducted within field research are mostly just conversations as opposed to formal interviews. But those conversations, since you will presumably have recorded at least some of them, still can be used as quotations in your research. This brings up the question, though, of the way in which people speak in everyday situations. And so the use of colloquial expressions, local idioms, and so on might have to be explained in the analysis section. And there's also the issue, excuse me, let me go back, the issue of the use of profanity. So people in everyday life will oftentimes use profanity. And so the question is whether or not this would be appropriate to include in your paper. And I recommend that you might just want to use the first letter followed by a series of asterisks or what have you. But Suzanne actually has mentioned that the gerontologist does allow profanity within the context of the paper. And so the idea here is you might want to check with the journal and what their policy is on these kinds of things. So as we have talked about before, each journal is different in what their policy is. One aspect of policy, though, that I have found somewhat to be troublesome for me, and I tend to write longer papers, and so when you confront a journal that wants an 800-page paper, that is, the page limit is 800 words, I frequently find that I have to cut down a paper from, say, 1,500 words down to 800 words. And so the issue of editing work, not just proofreading it, but editing, becomes a real necessity, but it's also, I think, a challenge as well to do that. That in reporting results, we go back to the research questions that initially were posed earlier in the paper. And I have found that, by the way, it's useful to number your research questions so that you keep track of them throughout the paper. So if in the introduction you said there's 3 important questions that we want to talk about, just refer back to this in the analysis section. And so you have question number 1 and followed by your analysis of that, question number 2, question number 3, however many there are. It's just disconcerting for a reader or a reviewer of a journal article to see questions that were discussed earlier on, but somehow they've dropped out of the paper. And so this needs to, one way of just watching this is to make sure that you just number them. So tips for writing a good discussion. You want to explain the findings in clear, simple English. And so, and of course, all scholarly work involves particular jargon of some kind or another, but there's a way of inserting jargon in a clear manner. So what you want to do is just make sure that you're communicating to your audience. And even though the audience will include people of the same interest or same area that you're in, it might also include people from outside that area who you're reading your work. So make sure that you just try to be clear in what you're saying. Yeah, so you want to go back in the discussion to your original hypotheses, connect with the literature review, and of course, discuss the limitations of your study. Let's see. Yeah, and this is Teresa Abba has mentioned here that it's really important that if your data is drawn from a cross-sectional study or if it's non-experimental work, that you resist the impulse to draw causal inferences from that data. And so even though you might want to try to create a sense of importance to your work by talking about causality, just the journal editors will not accept that if the data are cross-sectional. And also recall that if your population has a specific type of group within it, you have to be careful about generalizing to outside that group. And even within your sample, the generalizations may not apply to all parts of your sample. So you have to, just be careful about clarifying that. Okay, so here we go to a point that Suzanne has raised earlier about threading the conceptual model throughout the entire paper and to build coherence in the paper. And this is something that, as a professor for many years, reading many, many papers, not only undergraduate papers, but also graduate student papers, as well as drafts written by colleagues, sometimes you find that the drift is lost as the paper unfolds, and you're trying to figure out what exactly happened to a particular research question or to a particular theory. And so let me talk a little bit about that now. So the coherence that we're talking about, and I've mentioned before about research questions that are listed in the introduction, you need to follow through on that. And one simple way of doing that is to number the questions and to remind yourself that in the discussion to go back to each one of those questions and describe whether or not your analysis supported it or answered it or what have you. But a second way, and this is one that I think is more difficult to teach beginning writers, especially undergraduates, but also graduate students, is that, it's important to bring some kind of concept or theory that might provide a means of explaining the data. And so whatever that concept is or whatever that theory is, it goes into the introduction because you're going to talk about, what is the main focus of your paper. And usually that revolves around a concept or theory. But it's not sufficient just to bring it into the introduction. Of course, it has to come into the analysis as well, and especially into the discussion section. So you don't forget about that idea and you bring it back in and describe whether or not, in what way, it helps to understand the actual patterns of data that your paper uncovered. Yeah, so just summarizing here, and I just won't read through this, but make it simple. Try to number your research questions, and don't allow a particular concept to somehow drop out of the papers if it's gone AWOL. Okay, so here is the section that I was charged with writing, and has to do with the conclusions. And so it's important to remember that the ending of your paper is really just as important as the beginning. So even though the abstract is essential, the introduction is essential, so too is the conclusions. And I think the writing of the conclusions presents its own particular challenges. And so if you think of having a paper or any kind of writing as having a beginning, middle, and an end, oftentimes those conclusions, as well as the introductions for scholarly writers, are the two most difficult parts. And as Suzanne already mentioned, if you're trying to start a paper, oftentimes it's the easiest thing to do to start with the methods, because again, that's something that you probably already have done. And so you can start there and describe that. It might be harder, in fact, it usually is, to come up with an interesting introduction. The conclusions, though, are difficult because, well, for a couple of reasons. Sometimes what you want to do is to summarize what you found, but you want to do it in a way that is still interesting. So you're not just rehashing things, but you want to use different words, for example, or maybe to bring in additional examples that you can think of, or to maybe draw out the conclusions to other issues that might connect better with the reader and provide a more interesting ending to the paper. So to both summarize in an accurate way, as well as to continue to write in an interesting way, I think is one particular challenge of writing a conclusion. And the second one, and this is something that I think that is not often recognized, is that all of us, I believe, at least it's true with me, sometimes we come up with an interesting idea, or we think is an interesting idea, and we're interested and excited about getting started with the writing of it. And we do it, and we go through the entire paper. But by the time we reach the conclusions, we've run out of steam. We're just tired. And sometimes when I read papers submitted to journals, I think this is true for those writers as well, because the conclusion section might be so short. The person just lost interest by this point, or just grew tired of the paper. So this fatigue issue, I think you need to fight it, or give the paper a rest for a while, and then go back to it and try to write as interesting a conclusion as you're capable of writing. Now, some of these issues that we're about to address here become more difficult, and they're very contemporary issues having to do with inclusion. And one way that we can think about inclusion is to make sure that the language that we use is inclusive. And that is that it includes, and our samples as well, includes people from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of walks of life. And so the language that we use, and this is something that the Gerontological Society has provided, is that there are ways of talking about older people that does not diminish them or demean them in any way. And so avoid the use of jargons like seniors or the elderly or even the aged, and use terms that are more specific, like an older adult, an older person, or so on. And the GSA further recommends that you be as specific as possible. So you can talk about, for example, if your discussion is involving American women 75 years of age and older, that's how they are described then. And then avoid these euphemisms such as physically challenged or special. I mean, that's just, I think we're getting used to being annoyed if we were to see such language. And so the GSA recommends putting the person first. So a person with diabetes is a more humane way of describing the person rather than a diabetic patient, because that makes it sound as if the diabetes is the dominant factor of that person's life, which it may not be. Okay, so another way in which we want to think about inclusion is in terms of a social class. and ethnicity as well. Many of our students, and especially if your university is not, an elite private school, but even if it is, you will have students who are first generation college students or from working class backgrounds. And this is problematic in terms of not teaching a person to write, but evaluating the person's writing and encouraging the person to be a better writer. And sometimes it's as simple as the fact that that person's background may not have involved as much reading as, say, an upper middle class college student may have already done. And so without the background in reading, the idea of being a careful and elegant even writer is probably less likely. And so this is something that has to be kept in mind. And of course, we all can improve as writers, but I think the challenge here is not to be overly critical of especially students from working class backgrounds. Some of the challenges are much more concrete and practical. So just like finding a safe space in which to write and think. We may not realize it, but as students leave our classrooms, they may go back to an apartment or their homes that may not provide even a good place or a quiet place for them to do their work. So we have to keep this in mind. Now, it's very difficult to solve this problem, but we can at least become aware of the fact that some of our students may not have even a good, reliable internet connection, which we all know when we're doing literature reviews today is absolutely essential. So one way in which we as mentors can maybe not correct this problem, but at least ameliorate it to a certain degree, is to recognize that there are hidden injuries of class. And this is based on a book that Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb wrote with that title, The Hidden Injuries of Class, which was published in 1993. Earlier, Suzanne talked about the imposter syndrome, and this is essentially what we're talking about, at least in terms of writing, that one of the hidden injuries of class is that we do feel that somehow other people know things that we don't, and that we're just hopeless. And so we might be reluctant to share our ideas in the form of writing with other people, feeling that everyone already knows this. And related to this is the idea of cultural capital, which I think has become a phrase that's known outside of the social sciences. And this is the idea as simple as maybe the way we speak or the sound of our voice gives away our background, and people tend to then diminish what we're saying because of how we're saying it. I just finished a book by Fiona Hill, and you might remember her as from former President Trump's first impeachment hearing. And she was the person who worked for the National Security Agency. And she writes in her recent book, it was called There's Nothing for You Here, which was something that her father said to her, encouraging her to leave their home, their village in Northern Ireland, and to head out someplace else because there was nothing for her there. And she describes oftentimes throughout her life, and she is, a very accomplished, very brilliant analyst and an expert on Russia, for example, one who speaks Russia fluently. Describing that the way she spoke with this North England working class accent, her father was a coal miner, that people would dismiss what she said. And so this is an example, I think, of something that will not only reflect in terms of how we write, but also how people evaluate what we're saying. And I think mentors really need to understand this and not to dismiss students because of things that are linked to social class. So now we're getting to an even more difficult subject, and this is in terms of ethics of the writing and publication. And I have no great solution to the issue of authorship because I think a lot of research collaboration depends upon, either the university or the research group. Different labs maybe have different ideas of this. Whether or not the PI's name should come first, for example, on a journal article, even though the PI was not the primary writer of the issue. And so that is an issue that needs to be worked out locally, even though, let me mention this, even though I think professional societies will have, ethics, codes of ethics that they will publish. And oftentimes these codes of ethics will deal with issues of authorship, but sometimes it's ambiguous. So it's something that I hope changes so that for example, I say a postdoc who is a primary author of something, when the paper goes out for publication, that postdoc is the primary author and not relegated to a second or third position. And so this practice, it will give us in this example that you can think about. I have no good answer, although I have what I think should be the solution, but other research groups or labs might think about it differently. And this is another good case in point taken from a published study that you can, rather than reading through it now, you can look over whether or not you think this person, Dr. Colleen May, was treated fairly or not. And by the way, I think a lot of these issues can be resolved early on in a research collaboration by describing who will be, whose names will appear on the paper and in what order, so that there's an understanding about this. And I think this case of Dr. Colleen May is a reflection of that. Another aspect of this idea of ethics is proper citing. Now, of course, we're not simply talking about plagiarism, although plagiarism is a major issue, but sometimes plagiarism is inadvertent. And there's many cases of journalists, for example, who, in doing the research prior to publishing a paper, will take copious notes on whatever it is that they're studying, including interview notes and so on. But oftentimes we might be careless and we don't include in our notes the source of the information. And so when it comes time to going back to those notes to refresh our memory in terms of what we're writing, we're not certain. Our memory fails us in terms of, did somebody tell us this, or is this one of our own ideas that we inserted into those notes? And so I think the solution to this is to always notate when you're taking notes where that idea comes from. And then I think less likely to happen is when that you're writing something and you need to put a citation to what you're writing in order to support what you're saying. And sometimes you just rapidly or carelessly insert a quotation that may not be the best quotation, or excuse me, the citation to use to support what you're saying. And it could be that no one even recognizes this. But I think it's something that sometimes, as a reader of reviewer for journals, I will look up the citation to see if indeed it supports what the author of the article says it does, and sometimes it does not. So are citations always necessary? I love this issue because, over time, certain concepts, like in the field of aging, of course, disengagement theory, and everyone knows that it goes back to a book by Cumming and Henry, published way, I think, 1961. But how often do we have to continue to cite Cumming and Henry when we talk about disengagement, or when we talk about cumulative advantage, disadvantage? We know who was the first writer to talk about this, but it seems like it has entered into the public domain, so it may not be necessary to continue to cite this. However, I think it's always better to err on the side of caution. And so a if we submit a paper to a journal, the reader of the reviewer of that our paper may think that, we're just not repaying our intellectual debts, which we don't want to be accused of. And salami publication is several meanings to this. It could refer simply to the use of boilerplate. And so if you're writing several papers from the same basic data set, you will just have one description of the method, and you would include this word for word across these different publications. And that may not be the best idea to do this. You may want to vary it somewhat. Excuse me. But another way in which we can talk about salami publication has to do when we have two studies using the same model, and we might want to separate out those ideas into two separate papers. And this may or may not be the best thing. It could be that a single paper should include both of these studies. Yeah. So, and if there's also something I think we can call self-plagiarism, is when we bring some of our previous work into a paper that we're currently writing without citing our previous work. So we think that, well, I wrote that, so I don't have to cite it again. But it might be a better idea to cite the previous work. Now for a thorny issue of the political implications. And I think this is especially true, well, not just of social science research, but medical research as well. And definitely social policy research in the field of aging. And what I'm referring to is doing a study that not only makes a recommendation based upon an analysis of a particular policy issue, but clearly that recommendation might have a certain point of view. And some people might accuse us of not being objective because we're taking a stand on a particular issue. I'm less worried about that than other people may be. And so you may wish to argue on this point. But if I'm talking about Medicare, for example, or the care of nursing home patients, I will have an idea of what constitutes better care, or I will have an idea of how Social Security might be better financed, or how long-term care should be included in Social Security. And so, I mean, I don't know what else to say about this, but sometimes these issues are so thorny and so politicized. And we know that some of our political leaders might strenuously disagree with the perspective that we're taking on that. But I think that's just the nature of some of the issues that we're writing about. And I think that qualitative research, by the way, has a particular challenge to face in this, because with qualitative work, especially if you're doing field research, dealing with people in real world settings, and you get to know the people that you're studying, the difficulty is to keep as objective a point of view as possible, because I think the challenge is not to privilege the perspective of the groups that you're studying, especially those groups that have gotten a raw deal in life, and injustice and inequities characterize their lives. And so you might take their point of view, and this is perfectly understandable, but your writing needs to be as objective as possible. So I note here that this is a very fraught topic, and I don't think there's any easy solution to this. And here's another example. You all can go over that on your own. Finally, the question of politeness, especially if you begin to review papers for journals. I know back in the day, and my work in sociology goes back to the early 1970s, and going to professional meetings in the early 70s and more recently. And back in the early 70s, even at professional meetings, people oftentimes were quite mean in their discussion of papers, even when the author of the paper is sitting right next to them. And I think this tone has thankfully improved over the years, and people are much more polite. And I think this is a very positive development in our field. But it becomes, I think, more challenging to be polite when you're reviewing a paper for a journal, and something that the author of the paper says or doesn't say drives you crazy. You still have to be polite in your review of that. And we all like to be treated as by the golden rule of having others or treating others as we would hope to be treated ourselves. And so here is just a summary of what we have been talking about. It's difficult to start writing a paper because when you're looking at a blank computer screen or a blank piece of paper, how to start is difficult. And as Suzanne mentioned, there's no one right way to construct a paper or how to start writing it. And editing is absolutely essential. And one last thought, and I promise this is my last thought. In fact, we can go down to the last part of this slide. I think it's quite true that if you want to be a better writer, keep reading. Because when we read things like novels even, or newspaper op-eds, or many magazine articles written by professional writers, we might learn a few things, a few tips from their writing, especially writers in novels, for example, are really good writers, not just with the words they use, but the way in which they phrase things. It could be the simplest words of all, but just the way they phrase it is so elegant. And so there's hope, I think, for even academic writing to become better. And here's the list of references and writing resources that we can include. One that I like, by the way, is one, let me go back, is the last one by Zinsser on writing well. He recently passed away, but it's really a very, very nice book. So I will then ask Suzanne to get back, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Jim. So we are going to now turn the microphone over to two more perspectives. So we have a guest panel comprised of Dr. Jessica Kelly, who's the editor-in-chief of the Journals of Gerontology Series B, Social Sciences, and Dr. Karen Lincoln, who is an associate editor for mental health and social determinants for innovation and aging. We decided to have this panel because we don't want to just have two perspectives. We wanted some broader perspectives. So I am going to be monitoring the chat for your questions. I see that there are already quite a number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start with those. Jessica and Karen, welcome. And if you feel the need to send any questions back to me or Jim, that's fine. But I feel like what we've got so far in the chat, you will be able to handle just fine. So let me start with those. I see a question about use of first person. So I and we, first person singular or plural, because I think responding to something that I said. So that is one question we can start with.
So I can start. So I'm a sociologist and a social worker. In addition to being associate editor for Innovation and Aging, I've been on the editorial board for Journals of Gerontology, Social Sciences, and the journal, a sociology journal, a journal of that's focused on health. And so because I'm a sociologist, I was trained to use third person. And so I do see some authors using first person. And I do realize that sometimes that might be a discipline specific approach. I was trained in a different way, but I learned after I kept correcting authors or in my students for using first person, that it can be appropriate in some contexts. And so just with respect to my training in the journals that I've been an editor on, we typically see third person, not so much first person.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for letting us join your panel. This was wonderful. I learned a lot. So just one quick thing is I think there's a difference between third person and first person, and then really passive passive voice. Analyses were run, variables were coded. There are ways in which it's not so much necessarily like I measured this as much as you're not burying everything in passive voice. So really sort of read it for active voice, and read it for making sure that you're getting the points. Also, passive voice uses more words. So you can often shorten your word length simply by rearranging them to be more active.
And one thing I'd like to add, can I add something to that, Suzanne and Jessica? So, I encourage all authors, whether you're students or you've been writing for a long time, once you identify your target journals, and I certainly encourage you to identify at least 3. I mean, that's one of the things that I train my students. When you're writing a paper, identify 3 target journals, because oftentimes, your article is not accepted by the first journal. You don't have to lament for a long period of time. If you have a strategy, you can just kick it out, to that second journal really quickly, look at the reviews, see if they make sense to you. You don't have to respond to all of them. If you feel really strongly about something that you've written, then you hold on to that. You don't have to necessarily change it, but nonetheless, look at the journal. And as Jim said, read some of the articles and see how they're written. And that's really helpful cues for you to determine, the style of writing, whether it's first person, third person, and how it's used. Accepted articles are really nice models when we're designing our papers, particularly if you're looking at the journal that you have identified as a target, because of course, all journals are very different. So that's a piece of advice I'd like to offer.
Great advice. Any suggestions on how to balance information that needs to be included from equator guidelines with seemingly decreasing word limits? I think you probably hear this all the time. How do we get all this information in 6,000 words?
One thing I will, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a cold, that I do think people lament about word limits in a way that they think it's impossible. I have so much to say and I can't possibly fit it in. But the fact is you can. There are always places you could cut, or that got a little long, or you could make the arguments more efficient to find room. And that is especially at the revision stage. People say, well, you asked for so many new things, I couldn't possibly fit it in. But you really can. So I would say that's on the technical things. Again, I'm going to go back with what Karen said. Go to your target journal. You find articles that are very like yours, and then say, okay, what did they do? Well, they reported these things. This is how they formatted their tables. Here was their information, and make yours look like it already fits that journal. And that's a good way to know what should be in and what should be out. If something is missing, a reviewer will ask for it, and you'll know to be sure to put that in.
Thank you.
A quick note to that, if I might, sometimes there could be too many cooks in the kitchen, but more eyes are better, right? So if you're not sure, and sometimes we're really wedded to what we say, I'm like, I have to say that. I am so wedded to this paragraph, it must be there. Someone else might look at it and say, it doesn't really add to it. It doesn't really sort of help your argument. So if you're not quite sure what to cut, if you have someone else who can, that you trust, that might be more senior or more experienced, or just a colleague, take a look at it and see if there's something that can cut. So go through your own papers, highlight those areas that you think could go, or that you have questions about, and let someone else take a look at it and give you some advice.
Okay, we have another question here about overlap in your writing between your grant. Say you wrote a grant proposal, now you're writing up the article. What if the language if there's this overlap in both, is that self-plagiarism? Or what if work from a prior published work gets into a grant proposal? And what's going to happen if there's a plagiarism software that's looking at this?
Well, I think probably the same as you can say it shorter if you need to. You can also, the measurement, your variable measurement, or certain things may sound very similar or may have a lot of overlap, but the arguments themselves, you can refine your arguments to not be, word for word what was in the grant proposal that goes into the, there are ways in which you can sort of finesse that. Plus, you're also going to be looking at different audiences. A paper is going to be focused on one very specific thing. A grant proposal might have been a more broader set of strokes on that. So, but always, I would think, even the methods could probably overlap, but do make sure that you're finessing your arguments and tailoring them well enough that you're not just repeating yourself over and over again.
Anything to add, Karen?
Yeah, I think unfunded grants are like a great, fertile ground for papers. So if your grant was not funded, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. As a reviewer for NIA, I don't believe we use software for plagiarism. So as Jessica said, yeah, if you can tailor your arguments, make them shorter, but obviously if your grant's not funded, it doesn't matter. And if your grant is funded, I cite myself, right? So it's okay to cite yourself. And so that's not an issue of plagiarism, but if you said it somewhere before, then just, and it's been published, then cite yourself. That's perfectly allowable.
Thank you. Great point. And I will just comment that at least at the gerontologist, we do run plagiarism software on everything that we're going to accept. But I look at that software critically and look at the reports critically, just as you would as a faculty member looking at student work. And there are things, most of the stuff that it pulls up is perfectly acceptable. And if it isn't, I'm going to give you a chance to fix it. So it's not like we're not the plagiarism police. We are just, trying to help you do the best you can.
If I could just jump on that, because that's one of Jim's point about the salami science. I've actually had reviewers catch where they say, this paper doesn't look that different from this paper that was just published in this journal last year, and come to find out that the reviewer doesn't know, but I can see it's the same authors. So what they did is they barely changed a few things, sent it to a different journal to try to get a second publication out of it. And reviewers who read can find that. And so you want to be careful that you haven't, that your innovation is not so thinly cut that no one can tell it from what you've already published.
We still got lots of time for questions, so keep them coming in if you can. I'll just throw out a question to you right now. Just what are the errors or problems that you see most frequently in journal articles that you read that you think could be easily fixed?
Well, I'll start. First and foremost, it's the quality of the writing. I mean, as the associate editor, I get assigned papers that are within my particular area of research. And as the associate editor, I can actually choose to review the paper myself and make a decision without sending it out to reviewers. And if the paper is poorly written, not only will I not review it, but I won't send it out to get reviewed. So please make sure that, the words are spelled correctly, and spell check may or may not be, use that, but also you really need to pay attention. And I would always encourage you to have somebody else sort of take a look at it, but the quality of the writing is very, very important. Misspelled words, poor grammar. I mean, it sounds like, this is elementary, but we see it all the time. So that is a red flag. So please make sure that at least the quality of writing is strong, that everything is spelled correctly and they're using proper grammar, because you won't even get an opportunity for your paper to be reviewed. It could be like a really great science, but it won't get to the eyes of reviewers if there's grammatical or spelling errors.
And I would just add to that is fit. That I find that sometimes you have it in your mind that this paper is going to go to that journal, and that's just you're married to it. But the fact is, you may not have. Have you read the recent issues? Have you gone and looked and see if maybe this is the kind of work they do publish? Does your work look like those papers? If you look at your reference list and you haven't cited any papers from that journal, is that an indicator this may not be a good fit? And look at the scope and the mission. As well. Every journal has a scope and mission, and look and see if your work fits. So often we reject papers that were pretty good, but were not in our scope. And so we have to send them out to someone else.
And I want to just put a shout out to our third webinar coming along towards the end of the summer. That is precisely on that skill of tailoring your manuscript to a particular journal. So if you want more work on that, that workshop is coming up. I have a question here. Any tips for overcoming the fatigue that was talked about?
In terms of writing fatigue? Oh, Jim is unmuted.
Oh, please go ahead, Karen.
Oh, no, go ahead, Jim, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I would just put the paper down for a while and go do something else, and maybe take a week or two away from it. Sometimes with publication, especially for junior faculty who are under the tenure clock, you want to get things out as fast as possible. But even so, you might want to just wait a bit and come back to it feeling refreshed or with fresh eyes or whatever. But that's, I think, the simplest thing to do.
Yeah, I agree with Jim. I had writer's fatigue this week, but my house is clean because every time I got tired, I'm like, I'll go vacuum, and then I go back to it. And then I took another shot at it and I got overwhelmed and I cleaned the toilet. So my house is clean and my writing is done. You just really have to figure out, for me, it's forward movement. Like all of these things have to be done, right? And so I think I felt productive because I was able to get some tasks done around the house. Maybe I didn't finish that page, or maybe I didn't finish that paragraph or that thought, but I certainly got something accomplished. And sometimes just the feeling of getting something done sort of re-energizes me so that I can go back to the paper. I use the same strategy with Wordle, by the way. So sometimes I don't worry about the timer. I just go as far as I can. And it's amazing what you see when you come back to it. It's like, it's very obvious, right? But you just need to give your brain a little break.
If I can just add one other thing related to this, is just the idea of going out for a walk. So the brain, gets refreshed with fresher oxygen, I guess. But I know that if I go out for a walk or for a run, let's say, and come back, the ideas they come to you, and it's amazing. So I think the same thing is true with the fatigue issue.
The other thing is, don't rush what you think is the boring part, making sure the references are correct and formatted, making sure the tables are aligned and making sure the footnotes are where they should be and these sorts of things. Often what happens is once we finish writing the paper, we consider all that other stuff to be just noise, and we're just going to blow through it really fast because we just want it out. And that's where, as Karen was saying, that those errors really matter. Editors see them, reviewers get annoyed. Like if you've dropped references and they aren't in the back and people are looking things up, or your tables don't add up to 100% or other things, those things make it less likely to be successful. So take time, and if you're tired, walk away and come back, but make sure you don't rush through those other elements.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, thank you, Jessica, for that, because you triggered something. I'd like to add to something that you said and to something that all of you said, actually, Jim and Suzanne. And that is, I normally start writing my papers with the method section because it's done, it's just easy. I do tables first. It's easier to write my results from the table. So tables are easy. I can have the TV on or have music on and do tables. That's sort of, it's technical, but it sort of doesn't require a lot of critical thinking. So because I get started, that helps me get started. The other thing that I wanted to add, and this is something I learned in graduate school when I was at Michigan, is the discussion section. I was trained that it's like a completely different paper. And to Jessica's point, sometimes we get tired, we sort of finish the paper and then we're sort of get to that discussion section, and sometimes we just don't give it enough time. So I was trained that the discussion should be long. As a sociologist, I mean, it can go pages and pages, but it's really, really important. And if you're trying to rush it through, you want to make sure that you pay attention to the discussion. I would suggest taking a break at this point from the paper, writing down sort of the main thoughts that you want to convey, because again, you have to now refer to other literature to support your findings. And it is really a different way of thinking about this paper, because you're saying, we've done all this science, we have these results. What does it mean? What does it mean? What is the story that you're trying to tell? It's not just that we found this. What does it mean for practice, for policy, for even potential, future research? So you really want to take some time to think about the findings of this study and why do we care? Why do we even do this study in the first place? And how do you convey that message to your reader?
All right, here's a good question. I'm considering reworking my recently completed dissertation for journal submissions. Are there any cautions about doing this or any advice? I'll bet a lot of people are wondering about this problem.
Well, I can start. I did the multiple manuscript model when I was at Michigan because it was an opportunity, it was an option for us. And because I wanted to avoid that, sort of taking this big, huge dissertation and breaking it down into smaller papers. And so the dissertation was written into smaller papers with target journals in mind. So it was really, actually my last chapter was submitted 2 weeks after to Social Science and Medicine and got published because it was written specifically for Social Science and Medicine and similar journals. But I think, you know, I would sort of, not having done the traditional dissertation, you know, sometimes there's so many papers in the dissertation. You might want to sort of think about, well, how many papers are within this dissertation? How can they be broken up, you know, by topic, and what are some of the target journals? But Jessica, if you've done a traditional dissertation, you might be able to speak to that because I actually formatted my dissertation to avoid having to figure out how to break down this very large paper into smaller pieces.
I did too. But I would say, because I do mentor a lot of students who use the large monograph, you know, model. And I would say that where you want to look is you really want to sit down with it and organize it by your research questions. How, you know, could you break it out by your research questions? Well, this paper can answer this question, and then kind of mock it up. Okay, it would include these tables, or it includes these data, or it includes, you know, this, it would cover this topic, and then this one, and then this one. And so before you send out to anything and sort of give away all your best pieces in one, try to mock it up a little bit and say, this sounds like it could be 2 or 3, and then run that by your mentors who've read your work, and they can kind of comment again on sort of, well, that sounds like too small for this, or too big, that's too much for one paper, you know, or so on. And that, so that's kind of strategies I think going into it up front help you, because otherwise your tendency will be to take all of your favorite nuggets and put them in one manuscript, and what's left over might not be enough for another one.
Sorry, I'm okay. 2 really big questions, but one short one. So let's do the short one first, and then we'll go back to these long ones and see if we can do them in the time we have left. Any thoughts about using editing apps? That's the short one. I have no thoughts about that, but see if you.
I'll actually say I just was in a conversation with someone else about authors where English is not the first language. And I want to caution you against Google Translate and just run it through Google Translate, because it's not sensitive to sort of like idioms and sort of ways in which things sort of get conveyed. And it can sometimes lead reviewers to be a little bit confused about what it was you were trying to mean. And so, you know, that I'll just caution you against that, but do make sure, particularly if English isn't your first language, get some writing peers, get some pals, you know, who read it over for you and maybe flag some sections that need clarification. That goes a long way in putting your best foot forward for your work. That's not specifically on editing, but it prompted my thought.
I think that maybe the take home is there's no substitute for a human being in helping you edit. So there's that writing network that you need to develop for that. Okay, so here's one of the big questions. Any tips for writing the literature review component when you have several topic areas your research is bringing together, that there isn't a lot of existing work published at the intersection of those topics? How do you braid together background on each topic area?
I actually did that though, so I don't know how to answer it. So I did a paper. It's called Brainworks, and it's an Alzheimer's disease literacy education using mobile devices and talk shows to convey information about Alzheimer's disease to African Americans who, you know, with low literacy and low knowledge about Alzheimer's disease. Nobody's ever written anything on that, and it was an intervention. What do you do? So literally no one has done anything on this topic. And I actually published it in the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry. And so what I did was, it was really finding areas that could support the argument that I was trying to make. And that is that knowledge about whether it's health education or health literacy, particularly specific diseases. When people know about these diseases, they're more likely to recognize the symptoms, they're more likely to engage in help seeking and get cognitive screening, right? So it's like a health literacy area that I was able to tap into. And then because I'm using, mobile devices with, African Americans who are less likely to have access to internet, et cetera, there's, nuggets there in terms of being able to use technology with, underrepresented groups and how important it is. And then it was a culturally tailored intervention. So there was information there about the importance of culturally tailoring health messages to populations to increase literacy. So it was really sort of, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve? What are the different angles that I'm using to be able to solve this problem? And so even though there were no studies that were specifically looking at the topic, there were studies that were looking at the importance of health literacy and the importance of using culturally tailored interventions for hard to reach populations. There was, of course, literacy on Alzheimer's disease and race disparity. So it was really plugging into these different literatures and all put together to support the work that I was trying to do. And that's one of the challenges that we have in the research that many of us are doing with populations where there's very little literature. You do have to sort of find the studies that are similar, or at least support some aspects of the work that you're doing.
All right, I'll throw this other difficult question out here. What makes an effective table?
I can probably, I'll take a stab at that one. Fred Walensky, who is a well-known gerontologist, he was the one who really sort of said to me, he said, a really good table can stand alone, and a really good results section can stand alone. And so together they tell your story. So you don't want your reader flipping back and forth between the text and the table. You don't want to leave tables with, that don't have good titles, good footnotes, clear, notation. Don't make up your own notation. Really, and I would go back to, it sounds like a broken record, but I would go back to the journals and I would look at recently published papers. I think making tables is more of an art than a science, because figuring out how to convey even qualitative information in table form, like using it to summarize and then have it complement the written text is to me an art. And so go and read and see how other people have done that. Very similar to the kind of work you're looking at. Oh, here's multi-level modeling. Well, they did it too. What did they put in their table?
Anything to add to that, Karen?
No, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Some of the best models are published papers.
Yeah. And I want to just reiterate that point about having the table stand alone, because probably that's the most common thing that I say back to an author on the last conditional accept round is, I need better information in your titles and in your footnotes on your paper. I may know what B stands for, but not everybody will. And it might be a standardized regression coefficient. It might be the unstandardized regression coefficient, but you need to tell me. That kind of thing is really important. So that specificity is really important. All right, well, we are coming down the last minute. Are there any last minute questions, or from our panel, any last minute advice that you want to give to this attentive and large audience?
Well, I'll just add something really quickly and piggyback on what Jessica said. Tables, creating tables is an art, writing is an art, right? And practice makes perfect. So the more you write, the better you get. Right. And so use your team, find people to find other eyes. It doesn't even have to be an academic, call your mom, ask your sister to read it. You just need eyes on it. to get feedback. But it's really important for you to, get feedback, get support for your writing, and practice, practice, practice. You'll get better at it. And as Jim said, reading as much as you can, because when you read good work, it does really help improve your writing. So the more you read, the more you practice, the better you get.
And I'll just say as a last thing, I think this has been wonderful, and I encourage you all to go back over the slides and really pay attention to the information that was there. But we cannot underscore, as lonely as writing can feel, you need a tribe, you need a group, and you need, peers that are in the same place you are, plus senior ones, plus maybe some junior ones you're bringing along, and because you're learning something every way. When you teach someone how to write, you're learning better yourself, and so you really want to make sure you're surrounding yourself by people who are helping and giving you good, productive feedback. We all need it.
Oh, and one last thing, can I say one more thing? So when we talked about target journals, make sure you're not shooting too high or too low. But one thing I will say is that, journals that are strong journals, like the journals that are part of the GSA, the reviewers are really important. So even if you get a paper rejected, read the reviews. You get really good feedback from reviewers. And so you want to target journals where you have strong reviewers, because all of that is really invaluable information. So yes, it's horrible to get your paper rejected, but sometimes the reviews are really good, particularly when you have strong journals and strong reviewers. The feedback is actually very invaluable.
Well, thank you all for your wisdom and patience, and I really appreciate this excellent panel that has joined me today. We're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. This ends our webinar. So again, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.